Mr. Major, welcome to India.
Thank you very much.
You come at a time of great anguish for India, and I think there is a sense of profound appreciation for Britain's support to India's efforts in combating terrorism. In September 1992, you signed an extradition treaty and a confiscation agreement. What was the impetus to sign that agreement?
Well, India is a very old friend, of course. We have many shared interests. But the particular impetus for the agreement on extradition was the joint view shared by the British government, the Indian government, and indeed many other governments around the world, that terrorism was an international problem, and one of the ways of dealing with it was through extradition treaties. I hope we'll be able to ratify it before long.
Terrorism frequently becomes a platform for ethno-religious secessionist movements. You've had a problem with Northern Ireland. What becomes a legitimate response for a state, particularly when that perhaps is being fueled by a neighbouring country from across the borders?
Well, so I don't wish to enter into any particular disputes. There are many of them around the world. But states, like everyone else, have to obey the law. That is true in every part of the world. There is a law, and no state can legitimately be above the law. Terrorism operates entirely outside the law, and it's for that reason that I believe it is legitimate, indeed necessary, for states to band together and take special actions against the international dangers of terrorism. And that is what we all wish to do.
But frequently that sort of platform for terrorism has origins in ethnicity and religion. It's happening in Bosnia. It's a problem that Kashmir confronts. That's the basis of, in a sense, what's happening in Northern Ireland. Is there a unique response to that states need to look at differently from acts of terrorism which are motivated by displaced nationalism, perhaps?
I don't think it's so much the motive, it's the action that determines whether someone is behaving like a terrorist. It is the action that we must deal with, not the motives. And I think that is a view that's taken in many parts of the world.
Recently, the British government has said that the Shimla Agreement applies wholly and exclusively to the Kashmir issue. What role do you think that Britain might play in facilitating a dialogue between India and Pakistan at this time?
Well, I think one needs to be perfectly clear what one means by facilitating a dialogue. The particular problems of Kashmir can only be solved by Pakistan and by India. Third parties cannot solve that problem for them. As friends of India and Pakistan, as a fellow member of the Commonwealth, we are keen to see the problem solved. We're keen to see a dialogue between the two nations. We're keen to see a political process. We're keen to see any external funding or action that leads to militancy within Kashmir and adds to the problems. So we stand, as it were, as a friendly advocate at the side. It is not our job to be in the middle. We cannot solve the problem. We can encourage the two nations themselves to look at the problem and determine themselves how best to solve it.
Are there any sort of specific processes of dialogue or initiative that you have in mind or have proposed to facilitate this process?
Well, even if I had, I think it would be indelicate of me to talk about them. I think it is predominantly, and I mean it profoundly, it is a matter that must be determined between India and Pakistan. And I'm not myself sure that external detailed advice would necessarily be helpful to the solution of the problem, and that is what we wish to see.
The United States government has sought to put pressure on Pakistan. There have been statements urging Pakistan to desist from supporting terrorism in Kashmir. Does the British government share that perception?
We are keen to see both nations get together and talk. In the Commonwealth, we have a closer relationship, perhaps, than other nations, with India certainly, and with Pakistan as well. I think it is our view that quiet diplomacy and persuasion is the way to put the maximum pressure on everyone for a solution to this long-standing and very difficult problem.
Editorial opinion in your country has been somewhat critical of your visit to India at this time because recession seems to have bitten deep. You have growing unemployment, businesses small and large are closing down. What prompts you to come to India at this time? What are you looking to achieve?
I don't think there's a general view of criticism. I think the majority view in the United Kingdom is that our very long-standing relationship with India is very important. It's perhaps as good today, if not better, than it's been for many years. This is a very good opportunity to review political areas where there's a necessity for dialogue between the governments of India and the United Kingdom, and also a growing commercial relationship. So I think the predominant view is that it is a very wise thing to have this visit, and I share that view.
At a time when your own economy is struggling to compete globally, you bring a large contingent of British businessmen with you on this visit. What does Britain have to offer to India at this time in terms of India's own efforts at economic restructuring?
Well, I think you make too much of the difficulties in your question. There are many areas where Britain is still very much at the leading edge of technology. We have some of the largest and most competent companies in the world. They take that technology all around the world. Many of our companies are world leaders, and some of those are actually here in India at the moment. We have a great degree of confidence in the United Kingdom in the future of India as the world's largest democracy. The companies that have accompanied me on this visit see a great future economically and industrially and commercially for India, and that is why they're here. And they're here to discuss with the Indian government and discuss with Indian companies joint ventures and prospects that will provide, I believe, both prosperity and employment and greater trade patterns within India.
Less than half a century ago, Britain was the greatest power in the world. That power has dwindled substantially. What have been the sweeping lessons of history? What do you think Britain has learned from the last 50 years of its dwindling power? And what role do you see for Britain in the future?
I think Britain has a very substantial role. If you look at Britain's relationship with different countries around the world, we are at the heart of the European community, the largest free trade area in the world. We are still a significant part of the British Commonwealth. That's a remarkable collection of nations, unique in the history of the world. We have a long-standing and very special relationship with the United States. I know of no other nation, diplomatically and economically, that is at the center of such a hub.
There is concern among third world intellectuals about the new assertiveness of the United Nations, perhaps perceived to be led and nudged by the Western developed industrialized nations to intervene in what might once have been considered internal affairs of nations or bilateral affairs in Iraq, Somalia, Bosnia. Where do you think the fine line rests? Do you think one day it might be Northern Ireland, Armenia, Tibet, Kashmir?
I think you have to look at each of those individual problems as they arise and see what can be done by the international community as a whole. The United Nations is a very remarkable institution. It is perhaps more accepted around the world as an international forum today than it was even 3 or 4 years ago. A larger number of countries play an active role in the United Nations. It isn't just the Permanent Five and the Security Council that make decisions. There's a very wide degree of consultation right the way across the United Nations, and much of that operates on consensus, and that consensus must be shown in votes at the United Nations. The particular action against Iraq, of course, after their invasion of Kuwait, was authorized by the United Nations. When the mandate had concluded and the Iraqis had been forced out of Kuwait, the Western powers and their allies did not go right into Baghdad. It was not their job to do that. It wasn't their job to break up Iraq. It was their job to get Iraq out of Kuwait. They then finished their mandate and they finished their action. Thereafter, the United Nations collectively set down certain Security Council resolutions requiring certain action from Iraq. It is only when Iraq have failed to live up to that action that further difficulty has arisen. Our wish, certainly Britain's wish, and I believe that's true of other members of the United Nations, is simply that Iraq will obey the Security Council resolutions, and I believe we must ensure that they do.
But don't you think that the activism of the United Nations has sort of shifted after the end of the Cold War and the unquiet peace of the Cold War, and in the context of an increasingly unipolar world, that the United Nations is beginning to represent the interests of the Western Alliance?
No, I don't believe that. I think the United Nations is a force for good. And I know of no other force that can look at so many of the other international problems and seek to find a solution. The United Nations is not an aggressive entity. It's an entity that seeks to bring peace where there's war and help where there are problems. That is the purpose of the United Nations, and it stands as a servant not of one nation or any small group of nations. It stands as the servant of all the nations who are members of the United Nations.
The Western media is really beginning to define values and to define the problems and the vocabulary with which third world problems are looked at globally. Are you concerned about the overwhelming power of the media?
I think the media is very powerful. I think that is undoubtedly true. But that is a fact of life with which we have to live. I think we've seen time and time again in history that the power of thought and the power of people's instincts and their cultures and their history is very strong indeed. and I've no doubt that that will survive and thrive.
Hong Kong has long been a British colony. What has prompted Britain at this time, a few years prior to handing the colony back to China, to accelerate the process of democratic reform?
We agreed with the Chinese some time ago how we would act between now and 1997. We are acting as we agreed under the joint declaration and in accordance with the basic law.
The question, Mr. Prime Minister, was that...
That's the question I answered.
Why has the process of democratic reform been accelerated at this time and not 15, 20 years ago?
We're responding to the needs of people there and the requests of people there. You will undoubtedly have seen the result of the elections. You will undoubtedly know what people say. You will undoubtedly know of the agreement with China for what is known as the through train, to take a democracy and a range of other matters up to 1997 and through 1997.
There is concern in India too, and inevitably it will be a problem for the Chinese government to confront about the future of the Indians in Hong Kong.
Well, the Indians in Hong Kong have the same rights as every other citizen in Hong Kong and will continue to have so.
On a more personal level, Mr. Prime Minister, as someone who left school at 16, your family business failed. After 3 years in Mrs. Thatcher's cabinet, you hold the highest elected office in the United Kingdom. To what do you attribute your success and astounding sort of resilience in politics?
If I spent my time thinking about that, perhaps I wouldn't be sitting here. I'm more concerned with the practical problems I have to face today and the sort of future we want to build tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister.
Thank you.
Thank you.